Welcome to your student radio station, bringing you great shows.
Good evening, welcome to These Charming Men.
The Jam Jar here, I'm Matilda. And I'm Meg.
You are listening to Bangs and Mash.
This is going to be great.
Oh my God.
Great music.
An era-defining band. New single from Radiohead.
Great interviews.
Hi, this is Frank Turner.
My name is Sadiq Khan. I'm running through the Merrill.
My name is Eddie Izzard.
And keep up to date with the
A
arts.
poet, a playwright, and a cultural icon. He is, of course, William Shakespeare.
News and politics.
What about if the people are too stupid, though, to make this decision?
People make that decision. That's the entire point of a democracy.
Sports.
So close. He slipped through, brings it through on his left foot, just over the back of the net.
On-campus coverage.
When you think of Battle of the Bands, it just offers that real diversity.
Welcome to the big decision. This is Varsity Rugby.
Dying moments of the game.
Online and on 12:51 a.m. This is Raw.
This is my swamp.
Warwick Student Cinema are doing an outdoor screening of Shrek.
We'll never make it in time. Never fear. But where there's a will, there's a way, and I have a way.
Come on down to the Piazza at 10 p.m. on the 28th of June to check it out.
Well, yeah.
And the best part is, it's completely free.
Mirror, mirror on the wall, is this not the most perfect kingdom of them all?
Grab your friends and some popcorn and join us for some Shrek.
That's what friends are for, right?
My name is Eddie Izzard, and you're listening to Raw 12:51 a.m.
My name's Giles Brandreth, and this is Perspectives.
This is indeed Perspectives. It is Raw till 51am, your student radio station, and I'm joined here by some more panellists for another weekly edition of Perspectives, the politics show. I'm joined firstly by Ben. I was going to try and pronounce your surname. That's Newsham, isn't it? Ben Newsham. I'm joined by Lucy. I'm joined by Jack, and I'm joined by Barnaby Merrill, who I'm sure you've become accustomed to if you've been listening to the show. We're going to be talking today about a range of things, including reflecting on the EU referendum campaign and what we've thought of it so far and whether we'll be pleased to see the back of the referendum. And we'll also be talking about gun laws in the US in light of the Orlando attacks and in light of the Senate vote, which has rejected to put more gun control laws in for the US. But if you want to get involved in the conversation today, you can do so by tweeting us at Perspectives Raw or at Raw 12:51 a.m. You can Facebook us by messaging our Facebook page, Perspectives Radio. You can contact us by clicking the contact tab if you're listening on the web player. If email's your thing, email studio@radio.warwick.ac.uk. But I think we'll get straight into it today and talk about the Senate vote, which is our first topic of conversation. And I saw in the BBC that their headline went with, the US Senate has rejected plans to tighten gun controls, including the restriction of weapon sales to people on terrorism watch lists. Obviously, this is in light of the Orlando, Florida shootings, where 49 people were killed in the attack, and there were 4 proposals drafted after a Democrat senator did a filibuster for 15 hours to try and force a vote on the issue. He did get a vote on the issue, but as we know, that the Congress is dominated by Republicans at the minute, and the proposals were rejected. Before I ask the panel what they think of it, Republican Senator Joe Cornyn said, "Our colleagues want to make this about gun control when we should be making this about the fight to eliminate the Islamic extremism that is the root cause of what happened in Orlando." He also said to the Democrats, "My colleagues in many ways want to treat the symptoms without fighting the disease." And Democrat Senator Barbara Mikulski objected to this, and she said, "Why is it we would go through such incredible security to board an aeroplane to protect me against a terrorist, and yet we have no security of the people on the terrorist watch list to be able to buy a gun?" Now, obviously, this is not a new issue in the US. The issue of gun control and gun laws in the US has been prominent for a while. Matt Greenham told me yesterday, actually, that there have been more mass shootings in America than there have been days of the year in 2016, apparently. Jack, you know a fair bit about US politics. I think that's where your main interests lie. The US don't seem to want to implement legislation on, prohibiting certain people from buying guns. What do you think about that?
Well, I mean, certainly on with this certain piece of legislation, there is absolutely no way that it should have been passed at all. See, what it was that it would stop people on the terrorism no-fly list from being able to purchase guns. The problem with the no-fly list is that anyone can be placed on there, and it's in a secret court, and you have no due process, and you cannot appeal it. So if the government just doesn't want a certain person to have guns, they can just put on the watch list and immediately they'll have their constitutional rights, as protected by the Second Amendment, taken away from them straight away. There's no sort of... This isn't specifically about whether it should be gun control in that way, but is that the main objection what the Republicans have was that there was no due process involved in actually choosing the people who would be put on the watch list. Yeah.
But Jack, you're fairly libertarian, if you don't mind me saying that. That's perhaps where you'd argue your ideology is.
Yeah.
What do you think about the principle of people being able to have guns in the first place? Because in the UK, we deem that as ludicrous, don't we? Have openly the government allowing you to own guns.
Yeah, they do. I think the US have pretty much got it almost spot on with their Second Amendment. With their Second Amendment to the Constitution.
Okay.
I think it's really about the right to life almost, and one can use guns to protect yourself in a way that you can't, that any other weapon can. A gun is really it's the great equalizer. Let's say there's just a young woman walking down the street late at night, and a guy comes up and tries to mug her, right? Just in pure stature and in pure physical weight, it's statistically likely that unless the woman knows some kind of self-defense classes you have to gone through, even with that, she'd probably be massively overpowered and assaulted. But if they have a gun in your pocket, all it takes is just to take out and pull it. Anyone can protect themselves.
So you argue that
from violence.
You have to equal it out by the dangerous people who have guns need to be countered by less dangerous people who also have guns.
Well, no,
in a nutshell. Just before we go on to a few more people about that, I'd just like to give a quick shout out to my granddad who's listening, and this is not a random shout out, but he unfortunately doesn't listen to a lot of the show. So shout out to my granddad and my nan. And my granddad is actually 92 years old today, ex-D-Day veteran and Second World War. So just a quick shout out to him. Barnaby, on the issue of gun control laws, you didn't look best pleased with what Mr. Hadfield was saying then. I take it you don't agree that everyone should be allowed a gun?
That is just my face, but yes. The Second Amendment reads a well-regulated militia for the security of a free state. Now, I understand what you're saying about the issues of the terrorism watch list and things like that, but there are actual terror suspects on this list and also in FBI records that want to use this. I don't think somebody known to intelligence services as a threat being able to walk into Walmart and buy an AR-15 with zero checks, zero waiting period whatsoever, is in any way example of a well-regulated militia. It's not defending themselves against the government, they're defending themselves against some kind of sort of perceived ideological enemy, and I personally find it ludicrous.
So what do you make of Jack saying that it would help vulnerable people to have a gun as well?
Well, look, a vulnerable person can have a gun, and so will the dangerous person. They now have more guns, being that sort of person. And I don't think using a gun is as easy as you might want to think. The recoil on most basic handguns could break your arm if you're not set properly. I think handing them out to people willy-nilly is kind of protecting yourself against mugger, while obviously in theory makes sense, in practice will actually probably result in serious injury and possible death. But that's just me.
Lucy, what do you make of who are you more inclined to agree with on this issue, Barnaby or Jack, in terms of the issue of gun control?
I'm kind of in between because there are some pros and cons of each side. But if I had to pick a side, I would pick Jack's.
Okay, so why do you think the US doesn't want to put tighter gun controls on certain civilians?
Well, it would make sense to take them away from potential terrorists, but how can we know if someone is a potential terrorist? And how can we know if we're not taking a gun away from someone who's vulnerable or someone who would genuinely need it, like Jack pointed out?
But I'm sure Barnaby would say on that issue that why not just make it difficult for anyone to have guns in the first place?
Well, if a criminal is going to go out and they're going to kill someone, they're not going to go buy the gun legally. So what you're doing is would take away the guns from all the people who actually follow the law. If you put in so many controls that only the criminals can get it, then only people who will have intent to hurt people will have the weapons.
Okay, Ben, what do you make of that? Are you inclined to agree?
No, definitely not. No guns anywhere.
So you don't think that vulnerable people are best protected by having guns?
No, it's a ludicrous argument because if you can sell guns legally, there will be more guns in circulation. End of story. It's backed up by the figures. Countries with guns, more people die because of guns. End of the day.
But I mean, I suppose many people will argue that in terms of, as Jack and Lucy have pointed out, that criminals will get hold of guns regardless, and so why not allow the vulnerable people to have guns as well?
That's not necessarily true, though, because criminals in Britain, for example, are less likely to have guns than in America. We have less mass shootings per capita. That's not a numbers issue. It's compared to how many people we have, we still have less gun shootings.
Okay, Jack, what do you make of that? Obviously, Ben is not agreeing with your point there, saying that where there's more guns, there are more deaths.
Well, I think he's right in that, yes, where there are more guns, there are going to be more deaths by guns specifically, but you can't just actually look at it as guns. You have to look at it in terms of violent crime. When the UK passed the 1997 Firearms Amendments Act, homicide rates spiked up to quite a lot of levels. They only started to come down again after a little bit after the more police put them out in the streets, because stabbings had risen to compromise that. So it's really then, well, if you ban guns, then the criminals are then going to have knives. So you're going to ban knives, so then they're just going to have, pointed sticks with nails in them and attack people as well. They're always going to find some method of harming people. And it's going back to mass shootings and me talking about the defensive use of guns. Since 1970, there have been around 70 mass shootings or so, which is mass shootings, which is I might be getting stats wrong, but it's about, a mass shooting is where 4 or more people were killed by the same person in the same day, and so that resulted in a total of about 500 deaths. Right, every year in the US, these stats for defensive gun usage, as in people using guns to defend themselves, range from, depending on who you look at, both of them sort of government and peer-reviewed statistics, range from 50,000 to 1 million uses of civilians. I'll probably take the lower number. Okay. That's still 50,000 compared to 50,000 a year compared to 500 deaths in about 40. But Jack, people
will argue, why are we having this debate in the first place? The Constitution was written there to protect against Native Americans back where there was no police force. Why do we have it still now? See, when they say it's a well-regulated militia, that means to protect the state. That is, every individual. It doesn't mean, the government. It's not to protect against Native Americans. But what's it to protect against? And again, if we're going to talk about the Second Amendment, everyone says, the Second Amendment only covered, bolt action rifles or muskets or whatever. I believe it was Thomas Jefferson or it was Adams or Jefferson who said that a merchant ship wrote in to him and asked whether the Second Amendment covered cannons on his ship to protect against pirate attacks. And he said, of course, the Second Amendment doesn't just cover, sort of musket things. It is, it ranges up to anything, really. The Second Amendment, and again, it's a well-regulated mission to protect the state. It's there. The state is the people. It's really the primary reason for the Second Amendment is a doomsday mechanism, almost. It's basically there to stop a tyrannical government from really ever coming into power. The first thing a tyrannical government does, it takes away the guns of its citizens, so they're not able to fight back. Right, okay, Barnaby's tapping his finger quite aggressively there, so I assume he doesn't agree with what you were saying. Barnaby, where do you think Jack's got it wrong on this issue? Are guns not the best way to stop a tyrannical government?
Well, there is that argument as well, because a tyrannical government's going to have guns even if you have guns, even if they try and take them away. My issue just more widely is coming from the whole well-regulated militia thing. I accept the argument of it being a tyrannical government, but the people who are involved in mass shootings, sometimes it's political and sometimes it's just them sort of having mental or whatever. I don't understand how that comes into it. If you just walk, I don't understand why you should not be able to walk into a shop and fill out a form and all kinds of things about why you're buying the gun. Because if you're buying it for a reason, I accept that the Second Amendment is a thing in America and people are allowed to carry guns. I accept that fully. I don't like it, but that's how it is. But why can't we just have people proving that they're not buying the gun? And I know they can lie and everything, but just because laws are broken doesn't mean we shouldn't have laws. Otherwise, you may as well just sort of descend into anarchy.
Lucy, if we're just talking about not whether people should have guns, but that we can control who has those guns, surely that completely combats the... I mean, whether it's easy to determine who a terrorist is, surely just allowing people who are, they're on that watch list for a reason, surely they shouldn't have guns.
Well, that's a hard question, because if people are on the list, there obviously is a reason, but what if the reason was based on lies or false evidence or or a mistake? Like I remember one time, I think it was what's his name, the vice president. He was put on the no-fly list by accident once.
Really?
Yeah. So, and obviously he's not a terrorist. Well, some might argue differently, but
that crafty Joe Biden.
Yeah, so it's if we're talking about who has them rather than why, it's how can we prove who is who even in the first place?
Okay, Ben, do you agree with that? That having a sort of blanket list of who can have guns and who can't have guns is problematic because people will inevitably make mistakes and have people on there who shouldn't be on there.
I think if we accept that people are allowed to have guns, if we take that as given, even though I don't, but if we assume that, I do have to say I kind of agree with the Republicans on this, in that if we look at it and say this is a Second Amendment issue saying who can and cannot have guns, let's pretend it's a First Amendment issue. Let's take the same issue and say people on the no-fly list can't have freedom of speech. I am massively against that. So if you're guaranteeing these two rights on an equal footing, they both need to be protected equally.
Barnaby?
But that does come into how you define who's allowed a gun based on the language of the Second Amendment. It's normally taken to mean that you can have a gun if you want one. But whereas other people have read it to mean that you can have a gun if the state determines you're allowed to, or if the state feels that you're filling a certain role. And what I understand, I find the whole no-fly list, all these kind of anti-terrorist things, quite dodgy. But when you're talking about lethal weapons, I think that a certain larger amount of state intervention has to come into play.
Jack, you don't agree with that large amount of state intervention?
No, well, it's not that. Well, I think one of the better ways of preventing sort of mentally ill people, someone to have guns, is allowing shop owners to discriminate against who they do businesses with. So if you're a gun store owner and you see someone that comes in, that they're looking a bit dodgy, that there's clearly something not right with them, maybe they're scratching their head, they're looking around, they're looking very nervous and come in to buy a gun, you can tell from their face that they're lying for their reasons, you can just say, look, I'm not comfortable with selling you a gun.
But they're there to make a profit, aren't they?
Yeah, they are there to make a profit. But they aren't just. Most gun store owners are responsible gun owners as well. And there are quite a few cases where they sort of wanted to. I think it might have been Omar Martin, or where the shop owner said, look, he's a bit dodgy, and then he rang up the FBI or something. What I was going to say as well was in terms of one piece of gun control that actually does work and that I would support, in that there was a test, I can't remember in which state it was or which county in the US, they tried out not giving guns to convicted violent criminals. So that's only after they've already, they commit the crime and so they're in jail, and so they weren't allowed to purchase a gun. That means that law-abiding citizens were still allowed to have their Second Amendment rights, and they've been through a trial and found guilty by a jury of their peers to find that. And so what that means, when they actually looked at it, unlike most of the gun control measures which they've been trying to place, gun deaths dropped massively in that area, but it was opposed by the Democrats in Congress because I think the Black Caucus said it overwhelmingly affected poor black men because they were more likely to be involved in gun violence and gangs and so on. I think that was one piece of gun control that I would support, actually, in the long run.
Right, so just to go around the room again, this is sort of an unofficial vote. Do we think that the US we can see a situation in the near future, and by the near future I mean, perhaps 10, 20 years, where we see tighter restrictions on gun controls. Do we think that these mass shootings are going to force the US to regulate on it, or do we think it's going to keep happening and nothing's going to come in the way of gun control laws? Barnaby, can you see the US regulating more on gun controls?
Unless the NRA disappears off the face of the earth or Mitch McConnell gets shot at, then I doubt it strongly.
Jack Hadfield.
Well, there's already quite a few gun control measures in place, such as a ban on automatic weapons, again, the waiting list. There is quite a lot. I don't think we'll see overarching immediate gun control and a complete ban on guns, but I think we'll see... I think the Democrats might push for an extra ban on semi-automatic weapons or so on. I think there'll be, if there is gun control, it's going to come in slowly and under the radar, like all the other pieces have.
Okay, Lucy?
I think that there's not going to be very much more gun control measures because the Congress is dominated by Republicans, and even if a majority of people do want more gun control measures, you've still got the Second Amendment in place, so it would require some sort of constitutional reform to put through something permanent and really effective.
Okay, and Ben, what do you think?
I think in 20 to 30 years we could do, because by that time Congress could go Democratic again. And we have had regulation under the Second Amendment, so that's not necessarily stopping everything. I certainly don't think the Second's going anywhere there.
Okay, and right now, before we move on to a song and to further topics of conversation, I wanted to touch briefly, the reason this piece of legislation was brought about, aside from the shootings, in terms of pragmatic reasons, was the filibuster. And that's something that is common in the US. The senator spoke for 15 hours in order to delay this legislation, and though I don't know if it's perhaps legal in the UK, it has been used by the likes of Jacob Rees-Mogg. I think he spoke about Somerset eggs or something for a while, or why Somerset should go independent. Only Rees-Mogg knows. But what do we think about the idea of a filibuster? Because in the US, you could look back, I think it was Strom Thurmond who spoke for perhaps 24 hours once. Is this archaic? Well, obviously it's archaic, but do we think this should be allowed? Barnaby, I'll start with you first. Do we agree with the use of the filibuster?
It's a difficult one because you'll applaud Chris Murphy speaking 15 hours on gun control, and then you'll have a problem with Ted Cruz, filibustering the resolution. What we have to do is reform it so it can only be used for certain things. So I think in certain cases it can be sort of, if it's on a less kind of crucial point of legislation, it's okay. But because you have to reach 60 votes now to pass basically anything in the Senate, otherwise someone will filibuster it. And I think a similar thing can happen in other parliaments as well. And I think ultimately, as much as we might approve of one side or the other, you just have to make it so it can't seriously get in the way of actual lawmaking.
Ben, are you in favour of the filibuster being able to speak for however long you want? Well, to an extent, and about whatever you want, effectively.
I don't really, to be honest. I see it as it's almost a contempt for democracy, really. You're going against the views of all the other members that have been represented. Like, if we do take the American example, one person in the American system has the right to veto, and that's the president. Not senators, not congressmen, the president only. A filibuster is essentially a veto. It takes more effort, but you're taking that power that it wasn't given to you and overruling the will of everyone else. So that's completely undemocratic.
Lucy, do we agree with the use of the filibuster in being able to, delay proposals?
No, I don't actually. I mean, it has been used for good things in the past, but nowadays it's really inconvenient because you do have to get a lot of senators back in to veto the filibuster, and that means people having to fly back all over the country back to DC. It's really inconvenient. It can make everyone have to drop everything just to go back. It is stopping the debate happening and people exchanging their ideas and just discussing the legislation. So by one person just standing up and it's their freedom of speech to say they don't like it and to protest against it, but to stop the debate completely, I think it's just a bit overboard.
And Jack, do you agree with the use of the filibuster?
Well, I'm generally more in favour of greater restrictions on government and so the legislature holding the executive to account, and I think the filibuster can be useful in that way. But again, if it's only sort of one person going against that, and it can sort of stop a lot of stuff going through, I wouldn't ban it completely. But for example, I might put sort of like a 5-hour time limit on a filibuster, and that means you have to get more people to sort of filibuster after you and keep the filibuster going on, almost like a chain, sort of in that way. So I think the filibuster, in principle, is sort of a good idea, but I would have to have sort of more than one person do the filibuster, rather than just one guy holding up the democratic process.
So we're going to do a vote now. Who is in favour of keeping or allowing the filibuster? Say aye. Ooh.
Aye.
Oh, Jack. Who is against the filibuster?
No.
Yeah. Some groans in the background there.
I'm George Galloway, and you're listening to Raw. It's raw, and it's fantastic.
Right, we're going to move on now to a new topic of conversation, and this is in the form... Well, later we'll be talking about the EU referendum and reflecting on it, and we also have an interview with David Kurten, who is a new UKIP London Assembly member. But in terms of the actual EU referendum, there has been some stories emerging today about people rigging the vote of this particular referendum. And before we talk about that, I have a couple of messages in. Firstly, a message from Jack, who says, are people seriously arguing for people to own guns? Oh my God, what? I assume that's a reference to you, Jack. Another message in from Mark, who says, I'm getting fed up of the EU referendum with David Cameron bullying and using the fear factor and then taking more money off us students, pensioners and the disabilities. I feel he wants the money for himself and the other rich friends, brackets banks, for one. Also, David Cameron wants a job in the EU. Thanks for your message, Mark. And a message from Sai, who says, I have type 1 diabetes and under the EU I cannot drive because if I have one low in a year I am unfit to drive, but someone who has epilepsy can drive, so I can see no point in the EU paying millions and millions of pounds when it does not help myself, as the jobs I could get I would need a car, and I do not trust David Cameron anymore. So, we'll be talking about that a bit later on, about the EU referendum campaign. But now we're going to be talking about potentially rigging the vote. And YouGov and LBC, obviously the polling company and the radio station, have done a poll about the EU referendum, and it has been revealed that a third of Leave voters believe that MI5 is conspiring with the government to stop Brexit and determine the outcome of the referendum. So within the poll, it found that this number was particularly high with UKIP supporters, and 64% of UKIP supporters thought the referendum would probably be rigged. And also, there was various other things as well that that apparently 30% of UKIP supporters believe that votes have been rigged in the past, as well as 22% of Labour supporters. So those two are the two biggest conspiracy theorist parties, apparently believing that elections can be rigged. Ben, do we think that in our democracy that these sort of, not allegations, but rumours are actually plausible, that you would actually have perhaps Brexit supporters would argue that because, Brexit doesn't help the government immediately, it's in their interest to rig the vote. Do we think that's possible?
No, essentially. But I think this is all brought about by the rhetoric and language, really, on both left and right, of the silent majority, I think. It's this idea, especially UKIP's played on it a lot, I think, the idea that everyone's like you, they're just not saying it. And if these people believe that's true and they're not winning, something's gone wrong. Someone's rigged the vote. I think that's where it comes from.
So it's just people getting annoyed, basically, that their side are not winning.
Yeah.
And that's perhaps why the Labour vote is high on that, and UKIP, because you could have disenfranchised UKIP members because they got 4 million votes in the general election and one seat, and obviously Labour didn't do as well as expected. Jack, can you see a situation in the UK whereby the vote is actually rigged?
Yeah, I definitely could see, I definitely could envisage that. There has been, cases of electoral fraud, quite a lot. Obviously, with postal votes, there's cases in Tower Hamlets where postal votes were rigged. Again, if you look in the US, there are lots of dead people voting most of the time for the Democrats. Is
that actually a thing?
That's genuinely a thing. Dead people are on the electoral register,
right,
and they often, the majority of the time, vote Democrat. But yeah, something as big as the EU referendum.
Barnaby said smart guys then.
Something as big as the EU referendum. The government and big businesses, they have a lot to lose. if we do leave the EU. Now, again, I can see Ben's point, but I mean, right now, I do think it is verging on sort of 50-50. It's pretty balanced, and so. Like, I don't necessarily think that there'll be some sort of big operation and big cover-up, but I wouldn't put it past people to fiddle around with the votes in a few areas if they could get away with it, because just of how much money is really riding on this election, and
should
how
be having
serious
the
it
election
is.
in the first place then. But you say this point about rigging the vote, and the Tory party did announce that they would be having this referendum, and the Tory party did get into power. There was no vote rigging to get the Tories into power, and yet a lot of those people who voted Tory will be voting Brexit, and the voters knew full well, and the government who perhaps rigged the Tories in know full well that there was going to be a referendum on the EU. Surely you're just talking rubbish.
No, well, I mean, I think people have an idea that in the UK, we are a civilized society, and our politicians aren't corrupt dictators like some place like Africa or the Middle East or wherever there is something. But I've sort of seen, I've been involved in politics, and I've seen politics does actually have a dark side. I think someone told me, again, I won't mention names, but who was worked in Westminster, and that it's actually even worse than like House of Cards. House of Cards praise it to be. There are people who will rig votes and do things for money and power. We haven't escaped that in our democracy just yet.
I mean, obviously, we see not rigging votes, but people persuade. We see the whips persuading people to vote one way or another. The Tories had the famous Black Book, I believe it was called, where they had all the sort of all the allegations about MPs, of which there was quite a few in those days in the late 1900s. But surely someone listening to this and actually thinking, because when we hear things like Tower Hamlets, they are in the news because it is an example. That is not a rare. That is a rare occurrence, and the only reason that is in the news, not because it's common, but because it is being investigated and is being prosecuted. Pam's messaged in and has said rigged. Imaginings, because I think she's a bit confused by it all. Lucy, do you honestly think that in the UK there can be a situation whereby a vote could be rigged?
I think it can be rigged to some extent. Like, some of the votes could be thrown out, and you're replaced by people in the government, with the vote that they want. Like, some people have argued it has happened in the Austrian presidential election. There's also been things on behalf of individuals. Like, I don't believe that MI5 is conspiring with the government to do that. That sounds absolutely absurd. But there have been instances I've seen people post angrily to Facebook, groups saying that this is really annoying. I was on a walk with my dog and I found a whole group of our villages and polling cards just chucked into the marsh. You don't need your polling card to vote, but if you don't get your polling card in the post, it's like, well, can I vote? So if you're planning to vote leave and you don't know if you could vote, or if you're going to vote remain, if you don't know you can vote, you're hardly going to want to turn up in there and be embarrassed and be like, sorry, you can't actually vote, or oh, you can, and so some people, and I think it's much more likely to be individuals.
Yeah, so you and Jack would perhaps argue that it's not a government-wide scheme to rig the vote, but in certain places you do see ongoings that perhaps are unconstitutional, to say the least. Yeah. Jack, you've got something to add to that?
One thing. I'm just really glad that we do not have electronic voting systems. That is because that makes it so easy to rig the vote. There are so many ways that you can do this, and that's why, in general, electoral fraud in the UK has been minimal, again, compared to places like the US, because there are so many ways to intercept and break computers, but you can't use a pen to vote because there are fears that somebody could replace it with disappearing ink, and things like that. So apart from the postal voting, the UK system of voting by paper, and you put the ballot box, it's sealed up, it's taken in the back of the truck with two people watching it at all times. So with that, I think if it was going to be rigged, it would be done on postal votes because they are easy to do out. So I mean.
You do hear stories about dodgy postal votes.
I would definitely sort of ban postal ban or massively restrict postal votes to, so for example, maybe only elderly people or people in the armed forces are serving overseas.
So you wouldn't allow anyone to have a postal vote?
Apart from people serving overseas.
That's what I mean.
And
But
other people. But yeah, it should not be an option for general public because it's too easily manipulated.
Okay. Ben, do you believe? Why do you think that there's such a lack of trust in government institutions that people realistically think that what they are voting for isn't what they're going to get?
Ooh, I think it is just. It's people.
Is it just disenfranchised with politicians and everything, and they want to vent their anger?
We see it in all sorts of places. The way people have been, turned away from politics lately, like the expenses scandal and the low approval ratings of all politicians. People are not just turning off the politicians; they're turning off the whole system. That includes voting. That includes the belief that your vote matters. The whole thing just becomes seen as this corrupt, pointless waste of time.
Right, we're going to move on now to the EU referendum and sort of reflect on the campaign that we've seen. But before we do that, let's have a final vote on whether we can actually see, or not whether we think, whether we can actually see a situation whereby the government would rig a vote. So, all in favour that they think a government could realistically rig a vote, say aye.
Aye.
All against?
No.
Nay.
To be expected, I think. Right, now we move on to
party line.
we move on to the EU campaign now, and obviously it has been in the news forever, it would seem, and some of us might be quite pleased come Thursday when...
What's happening on Thursday?
People might be quite pleased to see it all over, to be brutally honest. But nonetheless, it's still going on, and have we learnt anything about the campaign that we didn't know already? So, in terms of individual politicians, have we changed our opinion on Michael Gove? Have we changed our opinion on some? Has there been some politicians that you perhaps hadn't heard of pre-referendum, and now someone like Kate Hoey, perhaps, and now they're well-established figures? Jack, I'll start with you.
Yeah, well, I've definitely got a great respect now for some of the Labour, Leave MPs.
So you've got a couple. You've got Kate Hoey,
Kate Hoey,
Graham Stringer.
Yeah, Graham Stringer. There's the
Dennis
German
Skinner.
one, Gisela Stewart.
Gisela Stewart, yeah,
as well. All these people have sort of. I sort of almost more respect for them than some of the Conservatives because it's harder for them to. Really to come out and say that they support Brexit because the majority of Labour MPs it's 90-something%, is it like 95% of Labour MPs are for remaining. These guys have sort of really gone against the tide, within their party to actually stand up and for what they believe in.
Has this referendum exposed something about Labour then? Because we see that high number that you just said of the Parliamentary Labour Party voting to stay in the EU. But then, whether these stories are right, it seems like it's going to be a far lower number in terms of Labour members and supporters, particularly up north, voting for Remain. Barnaby, is this just show that perhaps Labour aren't the voters of Labour aren't going to listen to the Parliamentary Labour Party, and they are not a pro-EU party?
Okay, it has been overplayed to some extent. I'm fairly sure the last poll I saw had Labour voters, not members, voters, over 60% in favour of Remain. I accept that there will be people in Labour who want to leave for varying reasons, but I would certainly say that the Labour MPs who've been voted for reflect the views of their constituents who voted for them to a greater or lesser extent. I think that it's just because The Guardian can't find a single person in Stoke-on-Trent to say they want to stay in a Vox Pop doesn't actually reflect the true state of affairs in amongst Labour voters.
Lucy, have you been impressed with any particular politician, or have you learned anything new from the referendum campaign, or have you just been bored of it?
I'm not really that bored of it, personally, because I'm for Brexit. This makes me really excited.
Okay.
But I've been. If there's a politician who has surprised me, it's been Cameron, from who he put in his cabinet after the election last year. He put in Priti Patel, which was a massive surprise to me because she's an ex-member of the referendum party. So what he did, he was like, I'm for Remain, but I'm going to fill my cabinet with literally half for Eurosceptics, which it doesn't make sense at all.
And he's allowed them to campaign either side, hasn't he?
Yeah. Well, after a lot of persuasion, he was originally going to force them to do Remain. But yeah, so he's surprised me the most. I mean, one other thing that sort of surprised me is that Corbyn is apparently personally for Brexit, but he's having to, he's campaigning for Remain, and you can actually see him struggle at sometimes, arguing for Remain when he personally believes otherwise. But so that does, it brings into question, again, like Jack mentioned, the Labour Party, maybe the whole Remain thing is just a front. Maybe the real, the rank and file members and more extreme left ones like Corbyn, that maybe they're more against Europe. So it is like really surprising what we have found out about both sides.
Ben, has anything surprised you about this particular referendum? I know you're a fan of Jeremy Corbyn, and a lot of people argue that he has not come off very well from this because he's been a Eurosceptic his whole life. But what would you argue? Do you think? Actually, this is a broader question. Do you think anyone has come off well from this referendum? Because the Conservative Party has been blatantly split. The Labour Party, a lot of the front bench are Eurosceptics who are, one could argue, pretending to be pro-EU, and it shows that the Labour voters aren't as pro-EU as the party. The Lib Dems have been absent. The Greens have been absent as well to an extent. Do we think anyone's come off well, Ben?
No particular party, I would say.
Because it's going to, it's increasing this distrust of politics, isn't it, this referendum?
Absolutely. I would say, on your question about changing views on politicians, the one I've been impressed by is John McDonnell. Which he's been in the background. He hasn't done much himself on the bigger stage.
He's done a lot of, Another Europe is Possible he's touring? It sounds like he's sort of news, doesn't it? Like he's a band, but
he's not, because people have said all along this referendum is going to be won or lost based on Labour in turnout, on whether we can get Labour voters out. And John McDonnell was the guy who came up with the whole Tory Brexit line. The idea it's not leaving the European Union; it's leaving the European Union for a Conservative government in a Conservative way for a capitalist outcome. John McDonnell's been the one pushing for this idea that if you want to leave the European Union, this isn't the way to do it.
Right, thank you very much, Ben. We're going to move on now to the Perspectives quiz, just so we can get that in before everyone looks very excited, before we have the David Kurten interview. It's very House of Commons in here at the minute. Yeah, brilliant. So here we go.
My name's Dave Nellis, and you're now to listen to the Perspectives quiz.
Right, you know the drill. 2 teams. We'll mix it up about this week. We'll have the coalition we'll have 2 different coalitions of Leave and Remain. So it'll be Jack and Barnaby versus Lucy and Ben this week. We'll see how you both get on. Right, the first question. Your buzzers are just going to be shout this week because obviously you're different views, so I can't find a unifying point between you today. So, number 1. Someone was aspiring to kill Donald Trump this week. I want to know, firstly, where they were from, and secondly, whereabouts it happened.
Buzz.
Jack Hadfield.
They were from the UK, living in California, and they did it in Las Vegas, Nevada.
They did do it in Las Vegas, Nevada. You can have 2 points there, Jack. Second question. Which famous England international footballer has today...
David Beckham.
Buzz.
I did see Ben there.
Put his hand up.
Okay, I'll reluctantly give that point to Barnaby.
Oh, boo.
But people need to start shouting. Come on, get your voice heard. Question number 3. Which party is standing against Joe Cox Ben got there before. Ben, which party is standing against Joe Cox in her seat?
Liberty GB?
Liberty GP is correct. 2-1 at the minute. Next question. Which Conservative peer recently switched from Leave from Leave to Remain?
Baroness Varsi.
Baroness Varsi is correct, although Nigel Farage hasn't really heard of her, apparently.
What?
He basically said that he hadn't heard of it. The next question is, what did Jeremy Corbyn say about Labour? Did he say, I'm confident Labour voters will vote to say, don't blame me if Jack Hadfield?
Don't blame me.
He said, don't blame me if Labour voters vote to leave.
No, I think I will, Jeremy.
You leave him alone.
Who did the Mail on Sunday recently come out in support
Remain.
of? Go on.
Buzz, Remain.
Remain. Correct.
Ugh. Daily Mail. How could they do this to me?
The regular Daily Mail didn't know.
Oh, Mail.
Who recently admitted that they used the death of Joe Cox to carry out polling data on the EU referendum? They're a major donor of a political party, and they said they didn't think that doing this was tasteless. Does anyone know the name of the donor? He's a pretty famous donor.
Not the name.
Ron Jack.
It wasn't Jack Straw's son, was it?
Jack Straw's son.
Tim Straw?
Is wrong. Barnaby.
Was it Lord Ashcroft?
Lord Ashcroft is wrong. The donor is recently defected from Conservative to UKIP, Aaron Banks, who I'm sure you have all heard of. Next question. What has Bojo said he will do post-referendum if he's wrong? Does anyone know?
No.
Oh,
he'll apologise if there's a recession.
That's correct. He said he'll apologise if there's a recession. And I think apparently he made reference. He said he'd make a Gordon Brown-esque apology on air. Barnaby looks pretty distraught. Right, now the next bit of the quiz is very quickly. Which of these people is voting for what side in terms of celebrity? So, Michael Caine, which way is he voting?
Buzz.
Leave.
He's voting for Leave. Correct. Next question. Patrick Stewart.
Buzz Remain.
Remain. Correct. Katie Hopkins. I
Buzz
didn't
Leave.
need to ask that. Douglas Booth.
Who?
I don't know, but he's supporting Remain. And finally, Bill Nye. Finally.
Buzz Remain.
Remain is correct. I'm not sure who won there. Thank you very much for listening. If you haven't kept with us the whole way there, I've been joined by Ben, Lucy, Jack and Barnaby for this week of Perspectives. I hope you see you soon. We will be back next Tuesday from 3 to 4, and on Thursday tune in for an election special show through the night to hear the results. Here now is my interview with David Kurten. Right, so I've just been attending a Old Malden EU debate, and I'm joined by David Kurten, a newly elected London Assembly member. David, firstly, what did you think of the debate?
Well, it was a very tough debate. It was a very feisty debate, and the closer we get to the time, I think the more forceful and the more that people want to put their arguments across, because it's coming up to the debate. So it was far more intense in terms of people debating, in terms of people wanting to win the debate than I've been at before.
The issue of Euroscepticism was previously quite quiet. I mean, UKIP were a minority party at the time, and now you're getting cabinet ministers who want to leave and whatnot. Why do you think UKIP's responsible for bringing it to the public frame, and why do you think it's suddenly spiralled out of control?
Yeah, absolutely, I do. And well, as a UKIP member of the London Assembly, I do definitely think that UKIP were really responsible in the Nigel Farage over 20 years or more fighting and campaigning to have a referendum. He is the main person who got this country to the point where we are having the ability and the opportunity of having a referendum. And I think it does come back to the last couple of elections with David Cameron was very, very afraid of losing seats to UKIP and losing votes to UKIP. So he promised a referendum before the 2015 election, probably thinking that he wouldn't have to call one, but he'd said it, and so he had to go ahead with it. He had to go through with it. He thought he was going to win, but actually now things are swinging towards the Leave side, winning the debate and actually bringing this country out of the European Union.
I'm at university. What would you say to young people who are perhaps on the fence? Why do you think they should leave the EU?
I think we should leave the EU because we have a whole world out there. And, people often make the argument that the European Union is not perfect, but we can reform it. And, they're our closest neighbours in terms of countries. We do a lot of business with the EU. And those things, it is true that we do business with the EU, but half of our exports go to non-EU countries. And I think, we will still be friends and good neighbours with the EU. Specifically, Article 8 of the Lisbon Treaty says the European Union must be good neighbours with the countries it borders, the countries that surround it. So I think as well as having the European Union, we can make far, far deeper cooperations and deals and work with other countries and friends and partners around the world, like Australia, like the Commonwealth countries that we in many ways turned our back on in the 70s. There's a whole opportunity, a world of opportunity out there. As well as the European Union, we need to look at the world as well.
Do you think the EU is democratic?
No, not overall. It has it looks like it's democratic. It has exactly the illusion of democracy. You put the words in my mouth. Exactly. So what people need to understand is that the European Union, it has 7 branches, but there are 3, the most important branches which deal with legislation is the Commission. The Commission is unelected entirely. Jean-Claude Juncker is the head of the Commission, and you probably don't know the names of any of the others. They propose legislation entirely. Then there is the Council of Ministers, which are the 28 heads of government, and then there's the Parliament. So the Council and the Parliament have to agree on the legislation proposed by the Commission, and then if they both agree, then it becomes law, the directives and regulations. It has the illusion of democracy, but ultimately, when Britain has objected to directives and regulations in the Council, we have basically 12% of the voting power. 77 times. Out of 77 times, Britain has objected to regulations and directives. We have been overruled and outvoted, and we really have no real power in vetoing and voting down things that are passed on our behalf.
And just before my final question, do you believe we are safer in the European Union? Because that's an argument frequented by Remainers.
It is absolutely not. The safety and security of this country comes from NATO. It comes from Europol. We would still be in Europol if we left the European Union. Norway and Switzerland and Iceland are in Europol. If we continue with the European Union project, it wants to expand into Ukraine, into Turkey. It's got arrangements with trying to make a free trade deal with countries in North Africa. And you've just seen what's happened with the migrant crisis over the last year. Could have been handled so much better, but the dilly-dallying, just not coming to a decision and coming to action quick enough has meant that the migrant crisis we have has spiraled out of control, and we have possibly thousands of ISIS terrorists wandering the European Union at the moment. In 5 or 10 years, many of those people will have passports and can come unrestricted to Britain. I don't want to see a terrorist attack in Europe. I don't want to see the security of this country compromised, and the best thing for us is to leave the European Union, still work with NATO, still work with the United Nations, we'll still have our seat on the Security Council, we'll still be in Interpol and Europol, but we won't be in the European Union. We'll have control of our borders, and that will give us control of our security.
And just a final question, you're obviously a newly elected UKIP politician. What do you think is the future for UKIP, whatever way the result happens?
Well, I think that the future of a lot of political parties is up in the air. The Conservative Party seems to be split down the middle in some way. You have Boris Johnson and Michael Gove on one side and Cameron on the other side. So I would expect something big to happen in the Conservative Party. UKIP will still be a voice, whatever happens. We do have unique takes on many other areas of policy, which of course don't get talked about at the moment because the referendum is a big thing, but we have policies on housing, we have policies on transport, policies on education, policies on defence and on police and crime. So we do have a unique position on all of these other issues, which really, I think, are very, very common sense. We're not from the left or the right particularly, but we just common sense. We listen to the voice of the everyday people, and we want to put in policies in place which enhance and make and give prosperity to ordinary people.
And you'd perhaps argue, perhaps similar to the Scottish National Party effect, that they had the referendum, what they were campaigning for, but they're still very much relevant in Scotland. The same with UKIP in England.
Yeah, well, I don't think many of our policies are the same as the Scottish National Party. But yeah, indeed, after the referendum, we will still be very, very relevant, and perhaps even more so. My name is David Kurten. I am a newly elected UKIP London Assembly member, and I am here being interviewed for Raw.